The wind carried the sound of a baby's cry across 3 miles of frozen prairie, piercing through the howl of the blizzard like an arrow finding its mark in Kalen Viral's heart. He pulled his painted stallion to a halt on the ridge overlooking the Sweetwater River, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter February air. Below, a cluster of abandoned wagons sat half-buried in snowdrifts, their canvas covers torn and flapping like wounded birds. The settlers had been gone for hours. He could tell by the way the snow had already begun to claim their tracks. But that cry, that cry was fresh as morning frost. Kalen's dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, swept the scene below. 28 winters had taught him to read the prairie like other men read books. And this story spoke of desperation. Broken axles, sick livestock, and families making the hardest choice the frontier could offer, what to leave behind so the rest might live. The cry came again. Weaker now, he urged his horse down the steep embankment, snow cascading around them like a waterfall of diamonds. His great-grandfather's words echoed in his mind. Tunkasila, the old man used to say, the Great Spirit sends us children when the world needs healing most. Kalen had never given those words much thought. Not until the cholera took his wife and unborn child 3 summers past, leaving him hollow as a dried gourd rattling in the wind. The sound led him to a wooden crate nestled beneath the roots of a massive cottonwood, sheltered just enough to keep the worst of the storm at bay. Inside, wrapped in a quilt that had seen better days, lay a baby girl no more than 6 months old. Her tiny fists waved at the gray sky, and her face, red with cold and fury, scrunched up for another wail that would have woken the dead. Easy, now, little bird, Kalen murmured, his voice carrying the lilting cadence of his mother's Lakota tongue mixed with the frontier English his father had taught him. Easy. The moment his calloused hands lifted her from the crate, she quieted. Her eyes, blue as summer sky over the Badlands, fixed on his face with an intensity that stole his breath. A folded paper fluttered from her blankets, and Kalen caught it before the wind could steal it away. Her name is Lyra Stormwind, the hastily scrawled words read. Born December 3rd, 1851. May God forgive us. May she forgive us. We cannot feed her and make Oregon too. She deserves better than dying slow. Kalen's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough wagon trains struggle through these parts to know the arithmetic of survival. When supplies ran low and the weather turned wicked, families faced choices that would haunt them until their dying day. But this tiny life nestled against his chest. She wasn't cargo to be lightened. She was hope wearing baby clothes. The stallion nickered nervously as the wind picked up, driving snow like buckshot across the prairie. Kalen pulled his buffalo robe around both himself and the child, creating a warm cave where her soft breathing mingled with his steady heartbeat. 3 days' ride to his winter camp. 3 days through country that could kill a man in as many hours if he made the wrong choice. But as he settled Lyra against his chest and felt her tiny hand grasp his finger with surprising strength, Kalen knew he'd already made his choice. The moment he heard her cry, "What do you say, little bird?" he whispered, touching his forehead to hers in the way his grandmother used to greet new babies. Ready to learn what it means to be Lakota? She gurgled, whether in agreement or protest, he couldn't tell. But her eyes never left his face, as if she were memorizing every line and shadow for future reference. The journey ahead would test them. Both. The storm showed no signs of breaking, and Kalen's supplies were meant for one man, not a man and a baby who would need more than hardtack and jerky to survive. His people would have questions too, hard questions about a white child in a Lakota camp, about a warrior who'd lost his own family suddenly playing father to another man's daughter. But those were tomorrow's worries. Today, he had a baby to keep, alive and a promise to make, not to her absent parents, but to the Great Spirit who'd sent her cry across the prairie wind to find him. He would raise her as his own, teach her the old ways and the new, help her grow strong enough to bridge 2 worlds that seemed determined to tear each other apart. As Kalen guided his horse away from the abandoned wagons and into the teeth of the storm, Lyra's eyes finally closed. Her breathing steadied into the rhythm of trust, the kind of trust that came when a child knew, bone deep, that they were safe. The wind held around them like a living thing, but within the circle of Kalen's arms, warmth bloomed like prairie roses in spring. 3 miles. Behind them, A lone rider emerged from the swirling snow, his pale eyes fixed on the tracks leading away from the river. Malric Vexmore had been following that wagon train for weeks, waiting for just this kind of opportunity. But he hadn't expected to find a Lakota warrior riding away with what should have been his prize. His thin lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. The baby would bring a fine price from the right buyer. And the half-breed who'd taken her? Well, there were always folks willing to pay good money to see an Indian brought low. But first, he'd have to catch them. And the storm was getting worse by the hour. The blizzard struck with the fury of a wounded bear just as Kalen crested the second ridge. Snow whipped across the prairie in sheets so thick he could barely see his horse's ears, and the temperature plummeted until each breath felt like swallowing ice. Little Lyra whimpered against his chest, her tiny body trembling despite the layers of buffalo hide wrapped around them both. "Hold on, little bird," Kalen murmured, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Not much farther to shelter. But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at his belly like hunger. The old trapper's cabin he'd been aiming for was still ours. Away, and Lyra needed warmth now. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made his heart race with memories of another winter, another child who'd grown cold in his arms before he could save them. The stallion stumbled, nearly going down in a hidden drift. Kalen felt the animal's strength flagging. They'd been fighting the storm for 6 hours now, and even his hardy mountain horse had limits. Through the driving snow, he spotted a dark smudge against the white landscape. A stand of pine trees clustered around what looked like an overhang of rock. "There, Takoza," he whispered to Lyra, using the Lakota word for granddaughter. It slipped out without thought, surprising him with how right it felt. "We'll wait out the worst of it." The shelter was better than he'd dared hope, a shallow cave. Worn into the sandstone cliff, deep enough to protect them from the wind and dry enough for a fire. Kalen quickly gathered deadfall from the pines and soon had flames dancing against the cave walls. Lyra's crying had turned to weak mewls that worried him more than her earlier fury. He examined her carefully in the firelight, checking for frostbite on her tiny fingers and toes. Her skin was cold, but not frozen, thank the spirits. But she needed more than warmth. She needed food. And Kalen had nothing but hardtack and jerky meant for a grown man's stomach. "Think, Hoxala," he muttered to himself, using his grandmother's pet name for him. "What would Yangtze do?" The answer came like a whisper from the past: pine needle tea. His grandmother had made it for sick babies in the camp, rich with the medicine the trees offered freely. Kalen gathered fresh needles from outside the cave, blessing the trees in the old way before taking what he needed. As the tea steeped, he fashioned a feeding system from his water flask and a strip of soft leather, creating a makeshift nipple that Lyra could suckle. She took to it hungrily, her blue eyes never leaving his face as the warm, slightly sweet liquid filled her belly. "There's my brave girl," Kalen said softly, stroking her downy hair. Fighting like a true warrior already. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small circle of firelight, something precious was taking root. Kalen found himself humming an old lullaby his mother used to sing, the Lakota words flowing like water over stones. "Hush now, little one. The eagle watches over you. Sleep now, precious child. The wolf will guard your dreams. Morning star will guide you. Buffalo will make you strong. You are loved. Chiankala, you belong." Lyra's eyes grew heavy, but she fought sleep as if afraid he might disappear. Kalen understood that fear. It lived in the bones of every abandoned child, white or Indian. He'd carried it himself after his father was killed in a cavalry raid, leaving him caught between two worlds with a foot firmly planted in neither. "I'm not going anywhere, little bird," he promised, settling her more securely against his chest. "You're mine now, and I protect what's mine." Hours passed. The fire burned low and Kalen fed it carefully, rationing his fuel against the long night ahead. Lyra slept fitfully, occasionally whimpering in dreams he couldn't fathom. Each time, he soothed her with gentle words and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It was near midnight when he heard it, the soft nickering of a horse from somewhere beyond the storm. Not his stallion, who stood drowsing near the cave mouth. Another horse. Another rider. Kalen's hand moved instinctively to the bone-handled knife at his belt. He'd lived too long on the frontier to believe in coincidences. Someone had followed their trail, and that someone was fool enough or desperate enough to travel in weather that could kill. Moving carefully so as not to wake Lyra, Kalen crept to the cave entrance and peered into the swirling snow. A shadow moved among the trees, tall, lean, walking his horse rather than riding. Whoever it was knew enough about winter survival to not risk his mount's life in the deep drifts. The shadow resolved into a man as he drew closer to the cave mouth. Pale skin, lighter hair visible beneath a wool cap, and eyes that reflected the firelight like a predator's. He carried a rifle in the crook of his arm and moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. Mighty cold. Night to be traveling alone, friend, the stranger called out, his voice carrying a slight accent Kalen couldn't place. Mind if I share your fire? It wasn't really a request. The man's grip on his rifle and the way he positioned himself at the cave mouth made that clear. Kalen weighed his options quickly. Fighting would risk Lyra's life, but something about this stranger set every instinct screaming danger. Fire's big enough for two, Kalen replied carefully, keeping his own weapons within easy reach. Coffee's fresh if you've got a cup. The stranger stepped into the firelight, and Kalen got his first clear look at the man who'd tracked them through a blizzard. Lean as a winter wolf, with pale eyes that missed nothing and thin lips curved in what might have been a smile on a friendlier face. His clothes were well made but worn, and he carried himself like a man comfortable with violence. Name's Vexmore, the stranger said, settling himself across the fire from Kalen. Malric Vexmore, and you'd be the half-breed who picked up some valuable cargo back at the river. Kalen's blood turned to ice water, but he kept his expression neutral. Don't know what you mean, friend. Just trying to get home before this storm kills us all. Vexmore's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. Oh, I think you know exactly what I mean. See, I've been following that wagon train for weeks, waiting for them to drop something worth my time. Imagine my surprise when I found their little treasure already claimed. The baby stirred against Kalen's chest, making a soft sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Vexmore's eyes fixed on the movement with hungry intensity. Pretty little thing, from what I could see, Vexmore continued, his voice taking on a casual tone that fooled neither of them. Blue eyes, blonde hair starting to come in. The kind of child certain collectors would pay handsomely for. No questions asked. Understanding hit Kalen like a physical blow. This wasn't some random bounty hunter or claim jumper. This was something worse. A man who traded in human misery, who saw children as commodities to be bought and sold. The kind of evil that dressed itself in civilized words and reasonable tones. She's not for sale, Kalen said quietly, his hand moving to rest protectively over Lyra's sleeping form. Everything's for sale, friend. Just a matter of finding the right price. Vexmore's rifle shifted slightly, not quite pointing at them, but ready to move. Now, I'm a reasonable man. Give me the child, and you can ride away with all your parts still attached. Try to be a hero, and well. He shrugged. Storms can be mighty dangerous. Easy for a man to lose his way, if you catch my meaning. Lyra chose that moment to wake, her blue eyes opening to focus on Kalen's face with that same intense trust she'd shown by the river. She didn't cry, didn't fuss, just looked at him as if she knew he'd protect her no matter what it cost. And in that moment, Kalen knew he would. This child had called to him across the prairie wind for a reason. She was meant to be his, meant to fill the hollow place where his own family used to live. No amount of money and no threat of violence would change that. Storm's letting up, Kalen observed, though the wind still howled outside. Might be we should all get some rest. Long day ahead come morning. Vexmore's smile turned predatory. Oh, I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight. Wouldn't want to miss anything important. But as the fire burned lower and the night deepened, none of them noticed the shadow that had been watching from the trees, or the war paint that marked the face of the warrior who'd been following a different trail entirely. The shadow in the trees belonged to Garrick Ironmore, and the war paint streaking his weathered face told a story of blood and betrayal that stretched back 3 moons to a burned-out homestead on Crow Creek. Garrick had been tracking Vexmore since the first snow, following a trail of missing children and grieving families across 2 territories. The man was careful, always covering his tracks, always staying one step ahead of the law. But Garrick wasn't the law. He was something older and far more dangerous. He was a father whose own daughter had vanished into Vexmore's network of buyers and sellers, swallowed up like a stone dropped into dark water. Now, crouched in the pine shadows with ice forming in his beard, Garrick watched the scene unfold in the cave below. The half-breed warrior, Lakota by the look of him, cradled a baby against his chest with the fierce tenderness of someone who understood loss. And Vexmore sat like a spider in his web, spinning words meant to trap and bind. But Garrick had learned patience from the wolves. He would wait. Let the night deepen. Let Vexmore grow confident in his position. And then, inside the cave, Kalen felt the weight of the stranger's stare like a physical thing. Lyra had settled back into sleep, her tiny hand fisted in his buckskin shirt, but her breathing remained shallow and quick, the rhythm of a child who sensed danger even in dreams. Interesting tattoo, Vexmore said suddenly, nodding toward the geometric patterns that spiraled around Kalen's left wrist. Lakota work, if I'm not mistaken. Your mother's people, I'd guess, given that mixed blood of yours. Kalen said nothing, but his jaw tightened imperceptibly. Few white men could read the meaning in Lakota tattoos, and fewer still would recognize the specific symbols marking him as Wachasa Wakang, a holy man's son, raised between worlds to serve as a bridge. Oh yes, Vexmore continued, warming to his subject. I make it my business to know things. Like how the army's been asking questions about a certain warrior who's been helping runaway slaves reach Canada. Calls himself Suing Manitou, the wolf. Ring any bells? Ice formed in Kalen's veins. His work with the Underground Railroad was supposed to be secret, known only to a handful of trusted conductors. If Vexmore knew about it, don't look so surprised, Wolf. Information's my stock in trade, just like those pretty children I collect. And right now, I'm thinking the army might pay even more for a half-breed agitator than my usual buyers would pay for one blonde baby. Vexmore's rifle moved another inch, the barrel now openly pointing in Kalen's direction. So here's how this works. You hand over the child, nice and easy. I take her somewhere she'll be appreciated. And in return, I forget I ever saw the famous wolf sitting in this cave. Lyra stirred, making a soft sound that cut through Kalen's heart like a blade. She was so small, so helpless, depending on him completely. Just like the runaway families he'd guided through these same mountains, trusting him to lead them to freedom instead of chains. And if I refuse? Kalen asked quietly to Vexmore's smile turned predatory. Then come morning, I ride into Fort Collins with your head in a sack and the baby bundled up nice and warm. The army gets their fugitive, I get my merchandise, and everybody's happy. Well, he chuckled, everybody who matters. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling toward the cave ceiling. In the brief flare of light, Kalen caught a glimpse of movement beyond the cave mouth, just a shadow shifting among shadows, but enough to tell him they weren't as alone as Vexmore believed. You've thought this through, Kalen said, his voice carrying the calm acceptance of a man who'd faced death before. I'll give you that. I always do. Vexmore relaxed slightly, reading Kalen's tone as surrender. Smart man. No point dying for someone else's cast-off brat when you could live to fight another day. But Kalen wasn't surrendering. He was remembering point 3 summers ago, when cholera had torn through the Lakota camps like wildfire. He'd held his wife Miraleth as she died. She'd made him promise something in those final moments. Promise that he'd never let fear keep him from doing what was right. Never let another child suffer because he was too afraid to act. You know what the Lakota say about wolves? Kalen asked conversationally, shifting Lyra to his left arm while his right hand moved slowly toward his knife. Can't say that I do, Vexmore replied, though his grip tightened on his rifle. They say the wolf who hunts alone dies alone, but the wolf who fights for his pack. Kalen's fingers closed around the bone handle. He becomes legend. Everything happened at once. Kalen threw himself sideways as Vexmore's rifle barked, the bullet chipping stone where his head had been a heartbeat before. Lyra's cry split the air, high and sharp with terror. And from the darkness beyond the cave mouth came the war cry of a Lakota warrior. Not Kalen's voice, but another's, deeper and filled with years of rage. Garrick Ironmore burst into the firelight. Like an avenging spirit, his tomahawk gleaming in the flames. Vexmore spun toward this new threat, but Kalen was already moving, his knife slicing upward to catch the rifle barrel and knock it aside. The cave filled with the sounds of violence, grunts, of effort, the clash of metal on metal, the scrape of boots on stone. Vexmore was skilled, but he was fighting two men who had nothing left to lose. Garrick's tomahawk sang through the air, missing Vexmore's skull by inches as the man twisted away. Kalen's knife opened a red line across Vexmore's gun arm, drawing a snarl of pain and fury. The child, Garrick shouted over the melee. Protect the child. Kalen needed no reminder. Even as he fought, he kept his body between Lyra and the violence, one arm cradling her against his chest while the other wielded his blade with deadly precision. She was screaming now, tiny fists waving in terror, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Vexmore broke away from the fight, blood streaming from the cut on his arm. His pale eyes darted between his two opponents, calculating odds that had suddenly turned against him. "This isn't over," he snarled, backing toward the cave mouth. "I know who you are, Wolf. Both of you. There's nowhere you can run that I won't find you." "Then stop running," Garrick growled, raising his tomahawk. "Finish this here." But Vexmore was already melting back into the storm, his footsteps quickly swallowed by wind and snow. Within moments, they heard the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Silence fell over the cave, broken only by Lyra's gradually quieting sobs and the pop of settling logs in the fire. Kalen looked up at his unexpected ally, a man of perhaps 40 winters, with graying hair braided in the old style, and scars that spoke of many battles. "Kola," Kalen said, using the Lakota word for friend. "I owe you my life." And hers. Garrick's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Keep the debt, brother. I have my own reasons for hunting that snake." His expression darkened. "He took my daughter 6 moons past. Little Tessara Nitriver, barely 8 summers old. Been following his trail ever since." Understanding passed between them like lightning. Two fathers, two lost children, two men who'd found themselves guardians when they'd expected to be mourners. "He'll be back," Kalen said, settling Lyra against his shoulder and feeling her relax into exhausted sleep. "Men like that don't give up easy. Let him come." Garrick's hand tightened on his tomahawk. "But next time, he won't walk away." Outside, the storm was finally breaking, revealing patches of star-studded sky between the racing clouds. But Kalen knew the real storm was just beginning. Vexmore would return with reinforcements, and when he did, a simple rescue would become something much larger, a war between those who protected the innocent and those who preyed upon them. And somewhere in the night, riding hard toward Fort Collins, Malric Vexmore smiled through his pain and began planning exactly how he'd destroy the wolf and everyone the half-breed held dear on broke, clear and bitter cold, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful if not for the danger riding toward them from 3 directions at once. Garrick spotted the dust clouds first, 3 separate groups converging on their position like the fingers of a closing fist. "Army patrol from the northeast," he reported grimly, collapsing his spyglass with a sharp click. "Maybe 2 dozen cavalry. Bounty hunters from the west, I count 8, maybe 10. And Vexmore's coming up from the south with what looks like a small army of his own." Kalen finished securing Lyra in a cradleboard he'd fashioned from pine branches and buffalo hide during the night, padding it with soft rabbit fur Garrick had contributed from his own supplies. The baby watched everything with those impossibly blue eyes, quiet now as if she understood their peril. "How long?" Kalen asked, checking his weapons one final time. "Hour, maybe less." Garrick's scarred hands moved efficiently over his own gear, tomahawk, knife, a captured cavalry rifle that had seen better days. "They've got us boxed in proper. Only way out is up." He nodded toward the cliff face rising behind their cave. Kalen studied the rock wall with a climber's eye. Possible, but barely, and not with a baby strapped to his back. One slip, one moment of lost focus, and Lyra would pay the price for his failure. "There's another way," he said slowly. "My grandfather's trail follows a hidden ledge around the north face, comes out near Eagle's Rest about 3 miles upstream. But it's narrow, barely wide enough for one man, and only if he knows exactly where to step. And you know, I should. Spent half my boyhood on these cliffs, learning the old paths." Kalen's mouth tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Problem is, even if we make it to Eagle's Rest, They'll just follow our tracks in the snow. We need a different kind of advantage. That's when Garrick's weathered face split into a grin that was all wolf and no mercy. Leave that to me, brother. I've got a few tricks Vexmore hasn't seen yet. They worked quickly, gathering what they could carry and preparing for a desperate gamble. Garrick produced items from his saddlebags that spoke of a man who'd learned warfare from both white soldiers and Indian raiders. Black powder charges wrapped in oiled cloth, fuses cut from braided horsehair, and small mirrors that could throw sunlight like weapons across vast distances. Signal mirrors, he explained, catching Kalen's curious look. My daughter taught me the trick. She used to flash them at birds just to watch them scatter. His voice caught slightly. Tessara always was clever with her hands. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Kalen strapped the cradleboard to his back, feeling Lyra's weight settle against his spine like a promise he intended to keep. She made a soft cooing sound, one tiny hand escaping, her wrappings to tangle in his hair. Ready, little bird? He whispered. Time to see if your new papa remembers how to fly. The climb began as a nightmare and got worse from there. The ledge Kalen remembered from his youth had narrowed over the years, worn away by wind and weather, until some sections were barely wider than his boots. Ice made every step treacherous, and the weight of the baby on his back threw off his balance in ways he hadn't anticipated. Behind them, shouts erupted from the cave as their pursuers discovered the empty shelter. Vexmore's voice rose above the others, sharp with rage and frustration. Find their tracks. They can't have gone far with a baby. Garrick waited until the search parties had spread out below, then began his work. The first explosion came from the north, a carefully placed charge that brought down a section of trail in a cascade of stone and snow. The second followed moments later from the east, sealing off another approach route. But the real artistry came with the mirrors. Garrick had positioned them during the night, small reflective surfaces hidden among the rocks at key vantage points. Now, as the sun climbed higher, he used them to create the illusion of multiple escape routes, flashes of light that looked like gun barrels or signal fires, drawing the search parties away from their true path. Brilliant, Kalen murmured, pausing to catch his breath on a slightly wider section of ledge. Below, he could see soldiers and bounty hunters chasing phantoms, following false signals deeper into the maze of canyons that surrounded Eagle's Rest. But Vexmore wasn't fooled. The child trader had found the beginning of the ledge trail and was following their actual path, climbing with the determined patience of a man who'd learned that valuable prey was worth any amount of effort. He moved carefully but steadily, his pale eyes fixed on the rock face above, as if he could see through stone to find his quarry. Company coming, Garrick called softly from behind. And he's not falling for the mirror tricks. The race became a thing of nightmares after that. Kalen pushed himself beyond endurance, his muscles screaming as he navigated sections of trail that would have challenged him even without a baby on his back. Behind them, Vexmore climbed with mechanical persistence, gaining ground with every minute. Lyra began to fuss, picking up on the tension radiating from her protector. Her soft cries echoed off the canyon walls, and Kalen realized with growing horror that the sound was giving away their position as surely as if they'd been firing signal shots. Hush, Giancola, he whispered desperately. Please, little bird, just a little farther. But she was hungry and frightened and confused, and no amount of soothing could quiet her completely. Each cry was another nail in their coffin, another advantage handed to the man hunting them through the rocks. That's when Garrick made his choice. Keep going, he said quietly, checking the loads in his rifle. Get her to Eagle's Rest. I'll buy you what time I can. Brother, no, my daughter's still out there somewhere, Garrick said, his scarred face set with grim determination. If I can't save her, at least I can save this one. Go. That's an order from your elder, boy. Kalen wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but Lyra chose that moment to let out a wail that echoed like a war cry through the canyon. Below, Vexmore's answering shout was much too close for comfort. Find my daughter, Garrick said. Promise me. When this is over, find Tessara Nightriver and bring her home. I promise, Kalen whispered, the words torn from his throat like pieces of his soul. I swear it on my ancestors' bones. And then he was moving again, pushing himself beyond exhaustion while behind him Garrick settled into position with his rifle and began to sing. The old death song of warriors who knew they wouldn't see another sunset. The song followed Kalen as he climbed, giving strength to his burning muscles and speed to his aching feet. When the shooting started, he forced himself not to look back. Garrick had chosen his moment and his ground, and looking back would dishonor that sacrificed Eagle's Rest. When he finally reached, it was a windswept meadow perched impossibly high above the canyon floor, surrounded by peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. An ancient eagle's nest crowned the tallest pine, empty now but still sacred to his people. Here, his grandfather had taught him to speak with the spirits. Here, he'd first learned what it meant to be Lakota, and here, 3 decades later, he collapsed in the snow with a white child strapped to his back and the sound of gunfire echoing from the cliffs below. Lyra had gone quiet during the final climb, exhausted into sleep by the ordeal. But now she stirred, her blue eyes opening to focus on his face with that same intense trust she'd shown from the beginning. She didn't cry, didn't fuss, just looked at him as if she knew he'd moved mountains to keep her safe. "We made it, little bird," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "We're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. The climb had bought them time, nothing more. Vexmore's network stretched across the territories, and the man himself was like a rattlesnake, wounded now, but not dead. He'd be back, probably with an army next time. The shooting below had stopped. Kalen said a prayer for Garrick Ironmore's soul and began planning their next move. They needed supplies, allies, and a safe place to raise a child who'd already survived more than most adults. But first, they needed to disappear. Kalen gathered Lyra close and began the long descent down the hidden trail that would take them to his winter camp. There, among his mother's people, they could rest and plan and figure out how to build a life from the ashes of everything they'd lost. The sun was setting by the time they reached the valley floor, painting the snow in shades of blood and gold. And in that dying light, Kalen saw something that made his heart stutter with hope. Smoke rising from the camp ahead, the warm glow of cook fires, the sound of children laughing and dogs barking, and people living their lives in defiance of a world that wanted to destroy them. But as they approached the circle of lodges, a new sound cut through the evening air, the thunder of many horses approaching fast, and the unmistakable jingle of cavalry spurs. The cavalry arrived like a storm front, 40 mounted soldiers in blue uniforms that looked black against the snow. But at their head rode not an army officer, but Malric Vexmore himself, his pale eyes gleaming with triumph as he spotted Kalen emerging from the tree line with Lyra strapped to his back. "There!" Vexmore shouted, pointing with his good arm. The other hung useless where Garrick's tomahawk had found its mark during their final confrontation on the cliffs. "The half-breed fugitive and my stolen property." But the cavalry captain, a weathered man named Darian Foxmere, raised his hand to halt the charge. Something in the scene before him didn't match Vexmore's fevered descriptions. This wasn't a savage kidnapper fleeing with stolen goods. This was a man protecting a child, moving with the careful tenderness of a father. "Hold your positions," Captain Foxmere ordered, his eyes taking in the Lakota camp spread before them. Families had emerged from their lodges, but they didn't scatter in panic as he'd expected. Instead, they formed a protective circle around their children, ready to fight if necessary, but not eager for bloodshed. "What are you waiting for?" Vexmore snarled. "Arrest him. He's the one they call the Wolf. Been helping slaves escape for years." Kalen stepped forward, his hands empty but his bearing proud. Lyra had awakened during the approach and now watched the proceedings with those remarkable blue eyes, calm as a mountain lake despite the tension crackling through the air. "Captain," Kalen said, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "I am Kalen Viral, son of Charging Bear and Rebecca Whitehawk. I am guilty of many things, but kidnapping is not among them." "He's lying." Vexmore spat. "I have witnesses. The baby was abandoned by settlers on the Sweetwater River, and he took her for his own profit." "Abandoned? Yes," Kalen agreed. "But not taken for profit. Taken for love." From the circle of Lakota watchers, an elderly woman stepped forward. Her name was Eloria Dreamfin, and she was the camp's Wenjiang Wakhang, holy woman and keeper of traditional law. Her weathered face bore the tattoos of her station, and her voice carried the authority of 7 decades. "Captain," she said, in accented but clear English. Among my people, when a child is abandoned, the one who finds them becomes their parent by sacred law. This is not theft. This is tawahi, family making. Captain Foxmere studied the scene with growing unease. He'd been told he was pursuing a dangerous fugitive who'd stolen a white child for ransom. But what he saw was an extended family preparing to defend one of their own, and a baby who showed no signs of distress or mistreatment. The child needs to be returned to her rightful people, Vexmore insisted, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. And who might that be? Asked a new voice from behind the cavalry formation. Everyone turned to see a small group of riders approaching. For adults bundled against the cold, their faces showing the unmistakable signs of hard travel and desperate hope. At their head rode a woman in her 30s, her hair the same golden shade as the baby's downy locks. Morel Starfin, the woman called out, her voice breaking slightly. I'm looking for my sister's child, a baby girl named Lyra, born last December. The silence that followed was profound. Even Vexmore seemed stunned by this development, his pale eyes darting between the newcomers and his quarry, as if trying to recalculate odds that had suddenly shifted against him. Sarah, my sister. Sarah, she was traveling with the Morrison wagon train. Morel continued, dismounting and walking slowly toward Kalen. They sent word before the cholera took her. Said they'd left the baby somewhere safe, with people who would love her. Lyra made a soft sound, her blue eyes focusing on the approaching woman with obvious interest. But when Morel reached out her arms, the baby turned away, burying her face against Kalen's chest with the instinctive gesture of a child claiming her chosen parent. She knows you, Morel said wonderingly, her eyes filling with tears. She's not afraid. She's been through hell, Kalen replied quietly. But she's safe now. She's loved. For a long moment, the two adults studied each other, the Lakota warrior who'd risked everything to save an abandoned child, and the white woman who'd traveled hundreds of miles to find her only remaining family. Around them, two communities watched and waited, understanding that this moment would shape all their futures. Mr. Vexmore told us you were holding her for ransom, one of Morel's companions said uncertainly. Mr. Vexmore, Kalen said with deadly quiet, makes his living selling children to the highest bidder. He's been tracking your niece since she was abandoned, planning to add her to his inventory. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Captain Foxmere's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he looked at Vexmore with new eyes, remembering certain reports that had crossed his desk, reports of children vanishing from frontier settlements, of a network of buyers and sellers that preyed on the desperate and displaced. That's impossible, Vexmore stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm a legitimate businessman. I have documentation. Documentation can be forged, Captain Foxmere observed coldly. But dead men tell true stories. It was then that the final piece of the puzzle emerged from the forest. Garrick Ironmore, battered and bleeding, but very much alive, carrying a small girl with dark hair and frightened eyes. Tessara Nitriver had been found at last, rescued from Vexmore's hidden camp, while the man himself was busy hunting other prey. This one knows all about Mr. Vexmore's business, Garrick said grimly. Don't you, little sparrow? The child nodded, her voice barely a whisper. He said he'd kill Papa if I told anyone. But Papa found me anyway. The truth crashed over the assembled crowd like an avalanche. Vexmore made one last desperate grab for his rifle, but found himself surrounded by soldiers whose loyalty had shifted. The moment they understood what they'd been asked to protect, in the aftermath, after Vexmore had been shackled and taken away, after statements had been given and papers signed, Morel Starfin sat in Aloria's lodge holding her niece and watching. Kalen with thoughtful eyes. She loves you, Morel said simply. I can see it in how she reaches for you, how she calms when you speak. And I love her, Kalen replied without hesitation. She saved me as much as I saved her. Then we have a problem, Morel said with a slight smile. Because I love her too, and I'm the only family she has left in the white world. They talked through the night. These two people from different worlds united by their love for one small child. By morning, they'd reached an understanding that would have scandalized both their communities if it hadn't been so obviously right. Lyra would grow up in both worlds, spending summers in the Lakota camp learning the old ways from her Aunt Kaylin, and winters in Denver with her Aunt Morel learning to navigate white society. She would be truly bilingual, truly bicultural, a bridge between peoples who desperately needed to understand each other. Years later, when Lyra Stormwind Viral stood before the territorial legislature arguing for Indian rights, or when she established the first integrated school in Colorado Territory, people would ask how one small girl had learned to move so easily between worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Those who knew her story would simply smile and say she'd learned from the very beginning that love was the only law that mattered, and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born to. So, if you're listening to this tale by firelight or on some dusty trail, remember that every child deserves someone who'll ride through storms to save them. And if you know of a young one who needs protecting, well, maybe it's time you learn to howl with the wolves. Now tell us in the comments where you're listening from today, and share this story with someone who believes in the power of chosen family.